And that's 2 o'clock, and we are back live at SHREC 21. I hope you all managed to get a little bit of a break, a little bit of a sandwich. I had a very nice banana, thank you very much. And we are back with another hour and a half of really good content and some networking to take us up to 4 o'clock. So stay with us if you can. Just catching up on some of the messages that you've been sending. It's really great to get your interaction. Judith Patton got in touch saying it's interesting that the Climate Change Committee is now talking of decisive transition. Decisiveness is certainly what we want and need. And I think actually that has been echoed right throughout all of the discussions that we've had so far today, certainly from Greenpeace as well. And Tor just had got in touch to pose a question to Finlay earlier on during that panel session just before lunch. I said I hoped that Finlay's fairly comprehensive answer did answer all of his points, and he's come back and said, thanks Finlay, very helpful answer, and presumably direct involvement by developers would mean that developers, in addition to keeping renewable energy projects running, would then have staff who had continuing roles working within local communities. This, I think, could work well, as small, isolated communities often suffer from burnout by local volunteers and need good technical advice on FE broadband. Really good point there, Tor. Thank you so much. Communities are so much more than just the resources they have. They are very much about the people who live there. And I think the minute we forget that, then we're on a short straw to, oh goodness, hiding to nothing. A few of you have been asking, obviously really enjoying what we're achieving today, and asking whether the conversations and everything will be available to watch again. The good news is that yes, we are recording everything that is going out during the course of this afternoon. So all the presentations, the conversations, the panel discussions will be available for you to watch again and to share with your own networks. Check out the Harper Macleod website. They've got a climate change tab across the top of their website there, and they will put everything, all the resources from today will be there, and of course they'll also be chunked up and put out on social media again. So use them, share them amongst your staff, whoever you think would be interested in seeing what we have been discussing today. So on with the conference. Last week I caught up with the panelists in this next session and we recorded our chat from home. Now, we'd planned to talk about decarbonisation and Scotland's natural resources, but as these things often go, we started with those topics, but we used them as a launch pad and we ended up talking about all sorts of other things as well. We only had 25 minutes. We know we could definitely have gone on much longer. Now, true to form, this being this year, Zoom glitched a little bit. It wasn't, yes, it's what we've all got used to. So if you'll forgive us the odd little hiccup along the way, please. The panellists were Robbie Kernahan from NatureScot, Joe Ellis from Forestry and Land Scotland, and Graeme Nisbet from Harper Macleod's rural team. And when we come out of this session, it's a 25-minute recording, we're going straight into another session, but I'm delighted to say that Robbie and Graeme will be joining us for a Q&A at 2:55. So any questions or comments that you may have for them will be scooped up then. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to myself in my dining room. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, for this session on screen, I have Graeme Nisbet, who is the lead partner of Harper Macleod's 15-strong rural team. Thanks for joining us, Graeme. Also, we've got Robbie Kernahan, who leads NatureScot's work to deliver sustainable growth. Nice to see you, Robbie. And Joe Ellis, who is Head of Planning and Environment at Forestry and Land Scotland. Really nice to see you too, Joe. Now, we have literally just 25 minutes to romp through an amazing and huge and fascinating subject. So I really hope that we can do it justice in the time that we have. We're going to be talking about decarbonisation and sustainable use of natural resources. And that's something that you three all know an awful lot more about than I do. So let's just dive right in. What are the main issues here and what can and should be done about it? That is a really big question, but I'm going to give you about a minute. Robbie, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Nicky. Where will I start? So I think climate change and biodiversity loss, those two things are inextricably linked. You know, globally, nationally and locally, enormous effort is needed to tackle them both. So when thinking about the climate emergency and the green recovery, I think the facts of the matter are that as we make progress in energy and transport and housing sectors, as we have been for some time, the importance of land use comes into much greater focus. So the challenge in shifting the rural economy away from its dependence on fossil fuels and traditional use of the land and sea towards a nature-rich net zero economy are significant. And it won't be easy. I think my overall sense is that the amount of change required to make that transition is not really appreciated by many. There's a real hearts and mind job to do. But it also requires systematic changes to policy and practice and probably greater urgency and focus if Scotland's going to meet its interim net zero targets. And I think that importance has been reiterated very recently. Das Gupta report published by the UK Treasury, an independent review of biodiversity and the economics of it, which says that nature is our most precious asset and we're all asset managers. But it also states that we're seriously mismanaging those assets with demands which exceed capacity. So that needs to change.
Goodness, that's a really strong statement there. Nature is our most precious asset, but we're mismanaging it. Joe, Forestry and Land Scotland, is that where you're seeing the things as well, or anything that you can add from your perspective?
I would completely agree with what Robbie said there. From Forestry and Land Scotland perspective, we manage 8% of Scotland. It's a really big land holding we manage on behalf of Scottish ministers and the people of Scotland. And where I see us being able to make a difference along the lines that Robbie suggests is to do things that help with the climate emergency, but also help with nature. So two of the big things that we're doing on climate, one is planting trees. So we create more woodlands, expand the woodlands in Scotland. But if we can do that in a way which supports nature, connects habitats, expands habitats with the right species, we can support nature too. The other one that we're doing at the moment that's really focused on climate change is peatland restoration. Again, that's a massive win for not just the birds and animals that use peat bogs, but also clean water, for loads of natural capital outcomes. So I think for me, trying to see these two things, climate and nature crisis, as very much interlinked, is where we'll make the biggest wins.
So interlinking then climate and nature, we really need to make big strides. Graeme, you are the head of the rural team at Harper Macleod, and you work alongside Robbie's organisation in particular. They're both public sector. You also represent lots of private clients, big landowners, farmers, who may have some resistance, shall we say, to the handing over or handing back of large swathes of land to nature in order to aid the green recovery. How are your clients or some of your other clients seeing this? What is the resistance? What needs to be done? What can be done? Gosh, that's a long question.
Well, listen, I think that there is a degree of resistance, but perhaps not as much as I think some sectors fear. I mean, there's very much a huge drive from the public sector, as Robbie and Joe have just touched on, in terms of pushing this emergency agenda forward. But actually, the scale of it is such that the private sector needs to be involved, both as direct participants and in funders. Otherwise, we're simply not going to meet our net zero targets. Now, we do have landowners who are very much vested in protecting and enhancing nature, whether that's conservation bodies, even traditional landowners or community bodies. But you're right. I think there's a bit of a carrot and a stick needed here, and we are. We now have companies and organisations who have to publish emissions and greenhouse gas data. And this information is freely available to investors, to journalists, and indeed to activists. And we're also seeing a range of emission trading schemes which work by setting emission caps on certain types of installations, such as oil refineries, offshore platforms, or indeed aircraft operators, where permitted emissions are reduced over time but can be offset by acquiring carbon credits. And we have a range of carbon credit offset arrangements throughout the UK, including the UK Carbon Land Registry, peatland credits under the Peatland Code, and woodland carbon credits under the Woodland Carbon Code, which all create, to my mind, significant opportunities for land use investment and indeed value. And that's something that I think the private sector is very much invested in, and indeed is where there's a huge opportunity for them. And that's just not not just landowners, because actually we're also seeing investors and funders that are really interested in this area and in the whole decarbonisation market piece, and are very much gearing up to play their part, and no doubt to get their share of the spoils. So I think that there are different drivers for the private sector, and some are perhaps a little bit more negative than others. But I think there's a real confluence of them coming together at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, money is absolutely going to be a driver, because let's face it, most people, businesses, private landowners, farmers, I mean, and the ESG standards for lots of businesses, I mean, that is going to help. I was just sort of reading some stuff in preparation for today, and Mark Carney from the UN has been talking about the value and rewards of investing in net zero climate solutions, and that is a fantastic opportunity. Robbie, do you see that from where you're sitting? Does this seem to you to be a welcome move forward?
Well, I didn't touch on green finance yet, but it is important to stress, I think, that whilst the market for carbon is in its infancy, there's no shortage of interest from private investors who will be fundamental to helping land managers make that transition. I think the challenge for us and others is to identify the revenue streams for investors, not just from carbon, but link them to those that manage the resource, i.e. the land managers. So I think there's a real opportunity for government and business to come together and align to create the type of investment opportunity for people to thrive, and nature and climate will benefit as a result.
Okay, and Joe, Graeme mentioned carrot and stick there. So, the carrot perhaps is this opportunity to invest to offset your carbon. And the stick, I mean, planning, does there need to be more input from the planning side of things?
Well, certainly, I think as a public sector body, we certainly have climate change targets that we have to meet as a public body. So that's, if you like, that's a stick for us. Quite apart from the need to do something about climate change, because we're seeing it happening all around us. So, we're seeing as a business, and we are public sector, but we are also a business. We're certainly seeing the impacts of climate change on our business, things like tree disease, like landslips and like flooding, this kind of thing. So from a very business-like perspective, I think land managers are starting to take this seriously, not just in the public sector, but all land managers. I would also say on the green finance, we've done a deal with Shell, and they are investing in projects on the national forest and lands, in tree planting and in peatland restoration. They very much are seeing what Graeme described as very much a need to show what they're doing on climate change, show that they are investing in carbon sequestration. And they're also very much looking for projects which tick the boxes in terms of the nature emergency. They want to be seen to be doing the right thing there as well. So I certainly support what you said, Graeme, that land managers and the private sector, I think, can work together really well on this, because there is money, there is desire to do something about climate change. And I think working together, we can actually develop some really exciting projects that do carbon sequestration, but also nature-based solutions, tackling the biodiversity crisis at the same time.
I like the sound of those exciting projects. Robbie, are you sort of working away in the background with these same sort of ideas?
Yes, Nicky, and I think just to build on that, we can't stand still. Change is needed, and I think COVID-19 has hammered home that lack of resilience. The virus has hit every part of our lives: health, well-being, education, finance, relationships, family, friends, prospects, and that reach is global, and I think has also exposed some of the social inequalities we've got. So even though many have come to value being outdoors and securing solace from nature, a lot of people simply can't get to decent green space in Scotland. And on a more fundamental point, the pandemic originated from an unhealthy relationship between the human world and the natural world, which can, as we've seen, can lead from disease jumping and mutating from species to species. And that same unhealthy relationship is also contributing to the degradation of nature across the world. Therefore, I think for me, it follows that ensuring society is more resilient against future pandemics must involve tackling both climate and nature. So that's the big picture. That's the big message I think we all probably get, but we all need to make that happen and probably turn that into reality a little bit more closer to home.
Okay, so we're in a situation where it is at crisis point? Do we agree, all of us, that we are at crisis point? I know prominent people like Chris Packham, for example, that lots of moves, and I think your organisation as well, I think NatureScot as well, have said there has to be, as well as a climate crisis, we have to officially recognise that there is a nature crisis. Is that the case, Robbie, Joe, Graeme? Who would like to go first on that? What about you, Graeme?
Well, listen, I think now that the tabloids are launching their own agendas in climate change and the emergency, I think that probably almost answers the question of outright. It seems to me it's unquestionable that there is an emergency and something needs to be done. But I also think the important thing around it is that we've got a growing public awareness of it and a growing groundswell of opinion behind it, and I think the tabloids and others are getting on the back of that. So yes, there is a crisis, but actually I think the first step to actually fixing it is recognising it.
So the first step to fixing it, there is a crisis. First step to fixing it is recognising it. Let's say that we've all recognised it. What's the next step? What is the next best thing to do? Joe, how would you like it to be?
For me, I think we have to work on this at scale where we can, particularly in the context of the audience we're talking to today. We are talking about big projects, big land management projects, big land use change. Now, I think everybody has a role to play, however small. So I think that's really important that we all have a role to play. But in the context of today, I think we all have an opportunity to make a really big difference and work together across land uses and land management types and between land managers. So for me, that's where I'd like to see us as starting, is to move out of our own boxes and looking at our own land and looking at Scotland as a whole and what we can all do together. We're working with partners in places like the Cairngorms, where we're working with mainly other public sector land managers at the moment, people like NatureScot, but also with NGOs like the RSPB and also private landowners alongside. And we can make a real difference if we work at scale on some of these solutions. So I think that's where I think we should start if we're talking about what do we do in Scotland.
Robbie, collaborative working at scale to find common solutions. Does that sit well with you? NatureScot, you're obviously working together, as Joe said, in the Cairngorms National Park and I guess elsewhere.
Yes, it absolutely does. I agree with Graeme and Joe, and we are in an emergency, and whilst we mustn't convey a sense of panic, I think we've got to recognise that and act accordingly. I said, nature is our most precious asset, and we know we need to up the ante, both to protect it and indeed to enhance it. Agricultural reform is underway. There are changes afoot to the regulation and management of our uplands. Alignment is key here from a policy perspective, including the extent to which government commitments to climate change will drive economic strategy, regional economic partnerships, the national planning framework, the spatial strategies, land use partnerships. All of that needs to come together, and I don't underestimate the challenge of that. But in the interim, there's lots of really good work going on to deliver those nature-based solutions. Joe's mentioned woodland restoration and creation. We've touched on peatland restoration, urban green infrastructure, and a great range of marine, coastal, agricultural, wetland enterprises, all of which are using nature, I think, to help tackle some of these challenges. But we need to do more. And I think as we all awaken to the importance of natural capital, we need to place greater value on how that's managed. And that's why Scottish Government are ramping up and committing to multi-year investments with £250 million over 10 years for peatland restoration, an additional £150 million over the next 5 years in forestry to support the economy and net zero goals. So there's an awful lot happening, and it does require that partnership working and operating at scale if we're going to make the difference.
Is it enough? Graeme? No, Robbie, you're smiling at that. Is it enough? You're laughing at that. Is it enough?
Well, I don't think we should underestimate the challenge here. I think everybody probably needs to think nature in all of our actions. It's not something that's done by others. It's part and parcel of what we all do every day. And wider transformation of land use requires a real cultural shift and a behavioural change, and that will take time. We need to take people with us here because we're relying on farmers, foresters, estate managers, gamekeepers to help deliver, and behavioural change is difficult. But so place-based collaborations will be key, community planning partnerships will be key, regional land use partnerships will be key, And I don't want to underestimate the challenge of making difficult decisions for competing claims on land. So I'm optimistic, though. I think we can do it. We've got a 10-year window, I think, to really make that difference, but we need to start now.
We have an audience of people who are working in or interested in renewables. So what is the message? What is the best message or the top key thing to say to them? Graeme, can we start with you?
Well, we touched on some of the challenges I think around that renewables perhaps has had historically in relation with nature and with the environment. Now, I think what we can see is a lot of lessons coming through from the renewable sector in connection with how they have adapted to nature and are working now collaboratively, to use Joe's expression earlier, with nature and with the regulators. Some of the peatland projects that are on, or some of the wind farm projects that are now going on peatland, are actually not only creating renewable energy, but also actively restoring peatland at the same time. So we are really seeing, I think, a more joined up approach, and I think that must and will continue. I'm not sure beyond that. There's an awful lot I would really say, unfortunately.
Joe, you were nodding there. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I'm just reflecting on my experience with the forestry sector. I think one of the things, and also Robbie's comment about culture change, I think one of the things that we're going to have to be thinking about is the sort of the holistic impacts that renewables have. So just thinking of the forestry sector, I think there has been a little bit of a tendency in the past to think, well, we do forestry, so we don't have to worry about climate change because trees are good, aren't they? So therefore, we just grow trees, carry on business as usual, and that's the climate change box ticked. But actually, it's much more complex than that. And we have to change the way we do forestry. We have to think about forestry differently to the way we would have done in the past, perhaps. And I think renewables is perhaps the same, whereby because renewables are are avoiding emissions by decarbonising the electricity sector, there may be a temptation to think, well, we're ticking the climate change box, aren't we, because we're doing renewables. And I think we have to stand back and think holistically about what the turbines are replacing and how all the infrastructure associated with renewables has an impact, and really work on minimising that impact at the same time as doing the positive things that renewables can do. So I think for me, it's a bit like what we've done in forestry. I think we have to stand back and look much more holistically at the industry that we're in, rather than just think, well, it's trees, it's good, isn't it? Or it's turbines, it's good, isn't it?
I think what was interesting is the story a couple of weeks ago about the coal mine being given planning permission in Cumbria, and the manager there, or somebody there, standing up in the news at 6 o'clock and saying, well, actually, this is needed. We need this coke coal because otherwise we can't create our own wind turbines. We need this as a fuel to create the steel, to create wind turbines. So nothing is in isolation, is it? Everything is a massive impact. There's, whether you're talking about needing a fossil fuel to create the steel, to create a renewable source of energy, or you're talking about the impact of erecting a wind farm onto peatland, and the impact that might have, or the impact on the environment of, well, we have to build this structure to bring offshore wind onshore and convert it to the clean electricity that we need. Everything is interconnected. So it's a case of the big picture. Robbie, we have to look at the big picture, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And I mean, I'm, again, kind of glass half full kind of guy, and I am quite optimistic that, we can continue to protect and enhance Scotland's natural capital at the same time as driving a thriving renewables industry. There are some risks in all of that. Of course, we understand them. And the risk, as you've highlighted, is they go from one extreme to the other. We can't have renewable energy at all costs. We need to have renewable energy alongside nature. It can't be one or the other. And we need to learn and find the win-win solutions rather than the trade-offs. But I think we can do that. I think the other thing, just to note here in terms of what we can learn from what's gone before, the land use targets within the climate change plan are really ambitious. And can we meet that ambition, whether it's for peatland restoration or woodland planting? Those challenges are huge, and there are questions of capacity and skills and the sheer scale of the task. So for peatland restoration, for example, creating an industry from scratch. But there's a real opportunities here too. So again, context, nature-based jobs grew at probably 5 times the rate of all jobs in Scotland over the last 5 years, and accounted for 1/3 of all job growth in Scotland over that period. So I think nature-based jobs are just emerging in some sectors. Urban green infrastructure, green finance, these are all growth areas. And I think those, we can expect those to develop quickly as demand for those roles grows. So I think we can turn this into a real positive opportunity to get to net zero and make sure that we have a natural economy. And that's a really good opportunity for Scotland to be world leading.
And of course, what we're seeing at the moment is a massive downturn in jobs in industries like oil and gas. So how, serendipitous would it be to be able to redeploy a lot of those people and get those skills and skill people up again to work in nature for the overall benefit of our country and that target of a full green recovery. We're reaching the end of our time. We're coming a little close to that. What I'd like you to do, if you possibly can, is just summarise from your own perspectives how our audience today, the renewables industry, can help come together to beat these twin emergencies, I guess, of climate emergency and the nature emergency. Would you like to go first, Jo?
I think it's going back to what I said before. It's about seeing this holistically. And I think if the renewables industry can take a step back and recognise its role, not just in creating decarbonised energy, but also in tackling the nature crisis, and can make its decisions on that basis, I think that the developments that take place could be a net positive for biodiversity, with restoring peatland around them, creating woodlands, minimising the impact. So I think the way that I would see renewables having their role is to continue to do what they do, but to make sure they do it holistically and see the big picture as they focus on energy.
Thank you. Yes, that's just captures it beautifully. Graeme?
Well, I perhaps turn it around slightly. I actually think the renewable sector can actually offer quite a lot in relation to decarbonisation and actually the journey over the last 20 years. So, we have a vast resource that was identified in terms of wind and wave, with a supportive regime wrapped around it. We had subsidies, making it financially attractive for investment and private sector involvement. And then we had this ongoing realization that this form of development was both sustainable and cleaner. So I think that all chimes very, very nicely with what I think is going to be decarbonisation and nature-based solutions going forward. In terms of lessons learned, perhaps I think one of the key things, and Robbie touched on it earlier, is really a strong policy focus and direction, which will allow markets to develop around about that. And again, we can see that coming through from renewables. And I think certainty is going to be essential here, not chopping and changing, and allowing stakeholders to structure businesses around plans and targets and then really capture these opportunities.
Fantastic. So I'm hearing a lot of positivity here, which I have to say, when we started talking about 25 minutes ago, I wasn't expecting. Robbie, you've been positive throughout. Finish us on a high.
Here you go. So I think in the short term, we've all got to learn from the awful impacts of this pandemic, haven't we? We're all feeling the need to do something different, and we need to shift, I think, from that model where we continually extract from nature, depleting its capacity to support itself and us, to one where we support nature in a restorative and regenerating economy. I think we can do that, but we as individuals must take responsibility. The collective, whether it's companies, communities, governments, or international institutions, must all step up. So I think we've all got a role to play.
We've all got a role to play, and we all need to step up, but there are lessons to be learned and there are job opportunities. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have learned an enormous amount in the last 25 minutes. Really, really appreciate your input. Robbie, Jo, Graeme, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And bizarrely handing back to myself from the dining room to us live here in the studio today. Thank you so much to Robbie and Joe and to Graeme for their input there. And as I mentioned, both Robbie and Graeme will be available just after the next session for any of your questions and comments. So please keep them coming in. On that front, Rob Gibson's been in touch. Now, unfortunately, Joe from Forestry and Land Scotland can't join us today, but here's a comment from Rob, which an interesting and a different angle on it. Forestry and Land Scotland needs to transfer forest land that's unfit for automated harvesting methods. Can this be sold to give best value for communities to go about cutting climate gas emissions and putting power into local hands that can be much more focused than a big corporation on building environmental diversity? Interesting viewpoint there, Rob. We will make sure that that is fed back, and it's good to have all of your comments. David, I can see you've popped up back on my screen again. It's time to hand back to you. Nice to see you again. Hand time back to you to learn from best practice from our European neighbours.